Hey guys, it's Joe here from Omnipoke along with Jack, and it's part two of the big pre-nationals prep talk. And we've gone through all the lower tier decks, and now we're going to talk about seven big boys that we think can be the things you're going to be seeing the most of. Definitely at your day at nationals. It's the stuff you should already be testing if you haven't already, and hopefully we can throw a few new considerations into there as well if you've not really thought about certain ways of playing these decks. I'm sure most of you know the archetypes in general, but there's definitely a few tech cards. It's actually going to be a big discussion on the techs, really, how
Yeah,
you can alter the
definitely.
decks, because it can really give twists to a lot of these already known popular strong archetypes. So the top one we're going to go for, we have to talk about it. It's Seismitoad. People hate it, people love it, people hate to play against it. I think that's universal.
Yeah.
Um, but Seismitoad Shaman, it's man, it is. I have to say, I think it's the most powerful archetype inherently. It is just so strong. DCE is your lock. That's all you need to start hitting for damage and stopping your opponent playing half or a third of their deck. Seeing as though we have Shaman, it is so strong. Sidetoad Shaman is going to be the main combination people are going to go for, and essentially tech your deck out with Headringers, Crushing and Enhanced Hammers, Lasers. That is it. Maximize those copies. Oh, and 4 Super Scoop Up for healing as well. So Super Scoop Up provides extra draw power for Shaman and healing whenever your opponent can't one hit you, which under Trainer Lock is a lot. So this is going to be very frustrating. It's a very flippy deck, but the number of times you get to flip these cards thanks to recycling them, seeing as many as you can in a turn, you can sometimes mill through 30 cards in a turn if you start going crazy. And then you trump card, get back all of those hammers, get back all of the super scoop ups. Over the law of averages, even if you are someone who flips poorly, you will get enough heads to do well with this deck. Very, very strong archetype. And Jack, do you want to come in with anything here?
Yeah, I mean it's going to be the most seen variant. There's going to be so much Seismitoad Shaman about. It's definitely the most consistent variant. It draws through the deck at insane speeds. Like Joe said, it can draw through 30 plus cards a turn. You can even see sort of them drawing so many cards without even using a supporter, because they know they can just dump stuff, get more Shamans, get into exactly the DCE, because they know they can just not Trevenant, trump card it all back into the deck straight away, within 1 or 2 turns, and all of a sudden you've got to deal with all of their hammers and lasers and headringers once again. Yeah, it's definitely one of the most annoying decks to play against, but you can understand why. It's probably the most consistent at doing what it's meant to do out there at the moment. But that's not the only way you can play Toad. There's loads of different ways you can play Toad. Like we've listed 7 here. There's easily probably another 7 on top of that you could pair Toad with and still get a decent result on the day, just because Toad is pretty much universal, especially as it's DC compatible as well. Things like you can continue to have Toad as the big main attacker with things like Crobat or Ninetales or even Garbodor, just to sort of provide extra sort of disruption for your opponent. Obviously, Bats takes out cheap prizes, really. Ninetales locks in your Verbank, meaning that you're always going to be doing an extra 30 damage in between turns. And then Garbodor shuts off your opponent's abilities. Again, abilities are going to be huge, as they always have been, and as they always will be, I guess, from now on. So shutting down your opponent's abilities will shut down, in essence, their own Shamans, because, as we said in part 1, Shaman is going to be in pretty much all of the decks you play against over the next few weeks, unless they're specifically trying to tech against Shaman, with things like Wobbuffet. So yeah, there's definitely different ways to play Toad. There's more than just those 3. The reason why I've paired those 3 together is really because they all hurt the consistency a little bit, and they all definitely suffer when it comes to Rayquaza. I feel the consistency is king when going against Rayquaza, and if you don't have as much of a consistent list, sometimes these tech cards aren't as useful in certain matchups. Obviously, the Ninetales is really useful against Rayquaza because they can't get their Shaman, their Skyfield on board. But if they can take out your Ninetales with Lysanders, obviously they're going to be playing probably a 2 count of Lysander. If they can take out a Ninetales before you can lock in lock them out of being able to play Skyfield, and they can get a Skyfield on the following turn. In essence, you've just given them an extra prize. It can sometimes help. Bats is probably the one that suffers the most against Rayquaza overall, because the damage is sometimes pitiful compared to a big EX. The biggest issue that Toad's always had is its initial output, and it relies on hammers and sort of head ringers to slow the opponent down, rather than big cards to do huge chunks of damage. Bats obviously increases that, but the bats don't increase it enough to be able to often two-shot Mega EXs. But there's definitely different ways you can play it. There's more than just those three ways, really. I feel probably Slurpuff has definitely gone down in play. Slurpuff Seismitoad was probably the most seen deck leading up to Roaring Sky's release. It was the most consistent deck out there. It drew 3 or 4 cards a turn, no matter what. Whether you end, it was completely end proof. Once this deck set up, there was pretty much no way you could get out of being locked for the rest of the game, just because of how quickly the deck ran through. But unfortunately, Slurpuff is completely outshined by Shaman now, really. I have seen people try to combine both, and it can work, but I feel that hurts consistency more than anything. I feel you're sort of overdrawing, and you don't have enough space for the cards you want to be drawing into, because you're drawing too many cards and you're not getting what you need. But yeah, there's definitely other ways of playing it.
Yeah, that's a big thing. You've mentioned all of these different tech cards, and they can be really useful for different situations, but it's just the space. Like a bat line, you probably need 4-4-3 or a 3-3-2. That is all your hammers pretty much thrown out the deck. So it's not a Shaman Seismitoad deck anymore in terms of you're not going to be hammering away. You're just hoping that this additional damage from the bats is going to be enough. Sometimes it will be. We've seen Seismitoad with the bats already before Shaman, and it's been fairly successful. But now that every other deck is quicker thanks to their own Shamans, can the bats keep up? That's a thing we have to discuss. Just going back, touching on a few other things, Ninetales, it's actually really useful against a lot of things. It can be really useful against Groudon, because after the Groudon takes the initial knockout, you keep the Barrier Shrine in. So then the Groudon can't actually get knockouts the following turn, unless they have all of their strong energy attached, which is rare, to be honest. They're going to be able to get all 4 strong energy onto the Groudon. So then you deny the prizes like any other deck, and you just rely on your Super Scoop-Ups once again to heal your Toad. So that's an interesting one to go down if you're trying to counter Groudon, although your output is still pretty poor because you're just using Toad and you don't have any of the other backup. I guess you could tech Mewtwo. That's something a lot of regular Seismitoad Shaman decks do have the space for. You can tech 1 or 2 Mewtwo. That in itself is a really good tech card for Groudon, because they have to stack so much energy on, especially if your headringers are active on them. So that's really good. A big one I'd like to talk about is Malamar, and this is basically the anti-Toad Toad deck. Basically, you're using... I've actually liked using this in the past. This was even before Shaman. You use Malamar and Aromatisse so that you can try and break the lock on your side to give yourself trainers whilst you're constantly getting the lock on your opponent. So you use Keldeo, Darkrai, all of these things with Rainbow Energy, as well as having DCEs, so that you can get that turn 2 lock with the attack as soon as you can get it, pretty much, with Seismitoad. And then you rely on your opponent flipping Tails on Malamar after you send them to sleep automatically, and then you allow yourself turns of trainers to then add up damage with lasers, or use max potions to heal yourself and effectively win the mirror. The issue with Malamar, it's definitely good against Toad, so that is like very, very strong. It doesn't help out as good with Trevenant. It means they can miss turns of attacking, which is great in a damage sense of things, but you're never actually going to break the lock until you get Lysanders. So it's sort of weaker against the Trevenant. It's not very good against Quasar. You can't do this whole healing aspect against Quasar. Most Rayquaza builds will talk about how they will adapt, but many of them will play Virizion. Most of the techs we even discuss are going to be colorless techs anyway, so you can always tech Grass Energy into those and have a Virizion in there. So the Malamar, again, is useless. Not too useful against Groudon. I mean, you can force them to miss a turn, but ultimately your output is still pretty shoddy. And Malamar really, it's focused on beating other Toad decks. So if you're expecting, 50% Toad, I think it's brilliant. But other than that, it's going to have weak matchups in terms of the other big 7 decks we're discussing. Also, there's Toad Yveltal. We've said how Yveltal on its own gets a lot worse. I think Toad Yveltal gets worse, just because, although you can help out in the mirror match against other Toads, just because, again, you're using your own Toad defensively, so that you can stack up a lot of energy onto Yveltal, sometimes get a big knockout. But these other Toad decks are just so fast now, it doesn't really matter. They're always going to have recovery power against Yveltal, so you give them that one turn of trainers by coming in and swinging with a Yveltal. That's enough time for them to go, boom, headringer, 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 hammer, 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 shaman, shaman, shaman. I've got a full board set up, and you're back to square one, pretty much. So Yveltal, not as useful as it has been in terms of being paired with Toad. So yeah, that's the Toad, I think, pretty much covered there. So let's move on, Jack.
The next sort of lock deck, I guess the only other real lock deck in the top 7 would be Trevenant, another trainer lock deck that just skyrockets in potential as of Roaring Skies. Obviously, Shaman in itself increases how good it is. Wally is an insane card for the deck. You can effectively lock quicker than Toad in certain situations, which is quite scary to think about, really. Because, as Joe just said, Toad is so quick nowadays. If you're dealing with something that can train lock a turn quicker, then you're going to be on a downward slope for a lot of the game a lot of the time. But again, there's so many different ways you can play Trevenant these days. I think the one that a lot of people are thinking about, or a lot of people have tried, is using sort of a hit and switch tactic, having Trevenant as something to stop your opponent, and then using either Shaman or Gengar, or maybe even Donphan. We'll talk about the Donphan variant a little bit later, but definitely Shaman and Gengar to hit and switch. I feel out of those two, I can see the potential in Gengar, but I think Shaman just does it so much better. You're going to be drawing every turn because you're going to be sky returning back into your own hand, letting you then throw the Shaman back down. If you get cards, you get cards, but by the time you're picking up Shamans again, you're not really hunting for cards anymore because you've already got a full board set up. You've got Trevenants out that are locking your opponent down, so you're just Shamaning pretty much for the attack then, which shows how quickly the deck sort of draws through itself. By the time you're not using Shamans for their draw support anymore, you can tell you've got everything you need. But again, there's loads of different ways to play Trev. I think probably the one that's seen most attention though is the Shaman variant.
Yeah, definitely Shaman is going to be the lead supporter in terms of helping you draw through with Trevor, because it's a naturally slow card in terms of if you want to attack with this guy, it's an energy and a DCE. Now, it's okay because you can't be hammered away, so every time you're going to get DCE and the Psychic Energy, or DCE and Mystery Energy to fulfill that cost, but you're only at 110 HP. And some things are going to be able to knock out fairly consistently. You're always going to be hunting for energy if you're attacking with Trevenant. If you're going down the route of I'll attack with either Gengar or Shaman, you can sometimes, Shaman retains the energy, so that's not an issue. The issue comes with the hit and switch strategy, is that you rely on either Floatstone, switching cards, or actually if you need to retreat with like a Gengar, you have to find like 2 Mystery Energy because you're going to be trainer locked a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And in those matchups, Trevenant just stays like a slug in the active. If you're not taking your own Psychic Energy to attack with Trevenant, he can just get stuck there. And although it's still disruptive to your opponent, you're getting nothing done on your side of the board other than the occasional crushing hammer heads. So I feel like the best way to play in Trevenant is at least teching Psychic Energy, like 3 or 4. You could go all out attacking with Trevor and having a relatively normal count of energy, expecting to attack with Trevenant the whole time, and then adding in techs like the bats. We've said how it can work with Seismitoad. Trevenant bats can work really well as well. Trevor has 60 attack to the active and 20 to 2 bench Pokemon. This obviously combos nicely with bats. They snipe as well in 2s and 3s. So this can hit odd and even numbers respectively as you like to try and kill the bench quite easily. And also you can increase Trevenant's power on the active position either with Bangle, Muscle Band, or like I say, you drop those bats on their face to try and get magic numbers. It can combine as well with Laser, and when you're thinking about Muscle Band or Silver Bangle, Laser, and Bat Drops, this is crazy, crazy big damage we're talking about from 2 energy effectively,
Yeah.
thanks to the DCE cost. So Trevenant can get really scary as his own attacker in his own right, especially because he's disrupting at the same time. Now, we do need to mention that Trevenant, although he sounds like the perfect card right now, we've just said how he's a slightly quicker version of Seismitoad somehow in terms of locking. People against Trevenant are going to buy themselves tons of trainers. They just need to draw into Lysander. And this is a really scary thing for Trevenant, because if they get Lysandered around, Shaman is a glaring weakness, easy 2 prizes for a lot of these decks. Definitely if you're using him as a hiding wall, they're not only taking the 2 prizes, they're trying to take out your following up attacker and that sort of stuff. So it's a real issue for Trevenant if your opponent finds Lysanders. And there's not too many ways you can counteract that, because once they find their Lysander, they can pretty much fulfill the turn that they want. And that's an issue. It does hurt the recovery power of Trevor as well. But if you are attacking with Trevor, it's not as bad. I guess, in a way, you get Lysandered out, you actually protect your main attacker. So it's an interesting trade-off. If you're actually attacking with Trevenant, they sort of need to keep hitting you in the face, which is good because you're a non-EX. Let's bear in mind as well, you can even tech Trevenant out even further. You can play Life Dew with this guy and deny prizes as if it was like a Donphan deck. So Trevenant has a lot of avenues to go down. We've also seen fairly recently Ross Cawthon. He did well with a Trevenant Gengar Raichu deck, and I see no reason why that can't still do well. Raichu, we've discussed already, really good against Quasar. His typing is fantastic. He's very powerful with Skyfield. You can allow other people to put Skyfield down and then just spend a crazy turn hunting for resources to find a full attack for a big Raichu on your side of the board. The possibilities are really crazy with Raichu now that the Skyfield's available to it. So a lot of ways you can play this guy. You do have to bear in mind that when you do get Lysandered around, it's a real issue for the deck, and you can't really defend against that. But it has a lot of inherent strength, like Seismitoad. It's an interesting combination, and definitely interesting mirror matches as well against those sorts of decks and against Trevor v. Trevor. Very, very interesting to watch, and how you can try and win those certain matchups with techs. Kind of difficult to do it. Most of the time it's just teching like 0-6 and Flare Grunts to try and slow them down, sometimes break the lock in terms of stopping Seismitoad attacking. And Lysander, obviously helpful in the Trevenant matchup, but it also can be a real weapon as well against Seismitoad, especially if you put a Headringer on another of their guys. You can force that Seismitoad into the active, and it obviously can't either retreat or attack, respond. So using supporter, like tech supporters, I know Lysander's going to be always played anyway, but increasing these counts can really bolster your position in the mirror match and against the respective other trainer locking deck.
Yeah. Both of them, it's really interesting to see how both of them sort of play against one another. Obviously there's benefits to Trevenant and benefits to Toad. They both have their pros and cons. I feel Trevenant hits a lot harder, especially if you're using it as an attacker, because you've got access to sniping and lasers no matter what. But I think Toad can sometimes be a little bit more consistent, and obviously doesn't get it doesn't have the issue with Lysanders, but then Trevenant doesn't have the issue with Headringers and things like that. So there's definitely pros and cons for you to weigh up if you're looking at either Toad or Trevenant. But I feel both are really strong plays at the moment. They're probably 2 of the best decks or best archetypes in the format.
Yeah, definitely. So let's move on to something completely different now. We're going to talk about Rayquaza, the colourless version. We've already talked about the dragon one in our first part, so check that out if you want to. But now we're talking about the colourless Quasar and the many forms that can come in. So Quasar is basically the new big hitter that we have. Thanks to Skyfield, we can fill our bench up to 8. Times that by 3, thanks to Rayquaza's attack for 3 colourless energy. We're hitting 240, which is pretty good, I'd say. And because of Delta Evolution, you can technically do that turn 1 if you're going second and wipe whatever's in your way out, pretty much. And this is obviously a threat. This is one of the reasons why Toad pretty much needs hammers right now to stop Rayquaza being able to run through you turn 1, then turn 2, then turn 3, and it's all over. So Toad and Trevor need hammers to keep up against Quasar. But in terms of playing Quasar ourselves, we can do a couple of things to help us out against those sorts of matchups. So the big one is Virizion Muna, and we've profiled this. It was one of the first ones I did from post Roaring Skies, and I really like Virizion Muna. It is fantastic against Toad. That is undoubtable, because you have, well, in my build, I played 2 Muna, so that's a 75% chance each turn to force them asleep at least, and then they have mainly flippy cards themselves to get out of the active in the terms of Super Scoop Up. So it's not actually going to be that often that you break the lock, but when you do, you only need that one turn of Mega Turbo plus DCE knockout. It's that simple. And also having Virizion gives you a lot of survivability. This is all of their output comes in the form of lasers pretty much. They are poking you for 50 a turn. You have 220 HP. As long as you can keep grass around for the majority of the time, thanks to Virizion, it's very, very good. Also, it's an interesting thing that you can actually use Virizion as an attacker. Most Toad decks play 2 or 3 Headringer. If they're focused on doing it onto Rayquazas, your Virizion can like sort of sneak in the back door and actually, once again, like normal, hit for 2 energy. And that's really difficult for Toad because then, again, you're getting acceleration on your side. So Virizion Moon is definitely an option. If you're trying to definitely beat the Toad, that's helpful. And Virizion helps reduce the output of Trevor to keep you involved in that game. An interesting thing about the Trevenant matchup, you don't need Skyfield at all. It's very easy, if you can get the energy at least, to kill Trevenants. So it makes something like Trevenant Bats a bit less desirable because they rarely have the space for the hammers as well as the lasers as well as the bats and all that stuff. So although that sounds like the most aggressive damage-based, it won't stand up to Rayquaza. Definitely if they're playing Virizion. Muna can stop their damage as well, which is nice. So it's pretty much an all-round good thing in terms of countering trainer lock stuff, but that then leaves you weak against lightning decks because you really only have room for 1/1 Altaria. And this is scary in its own right because 2 of the other decks in the very top tier that we're going to discuss a bit in the future, we've already said that Raichu can be teched into both of the previous decks pretty much because it's DC compatible. And that can just run through Quasar if you're not careful. Alternatively, you can play your own Raichu in Rayquaza. We've said how big of a hitter he can be. He can go to 160, I think it is, with a full Skyfield bench. You can tech Muscle Band, you can tech certain things that you want to get knockouts if you're not just trying to kill Quasar, which of course he serves the role perfectly. Also, he just fills up the bench and all that good stuff. He can also paralyze on a coin flip with Pikachu, which is fun, trying to buy you turns out of trainer lock, which is fun in its own right. It's like a mini Muna. I wouldn't advise it, but it's still a tactic you can go for. Then there's also just the speed build. Everyone loves the speed build of Quasar because it's going to win you the mirror match. It's going to have the best terms of setup. And once you do get the setup, it's basically asking your opponent the question, can you get, rid of my stadium? Can you stop me setting up this quick? And a lot of the time they can't. Hammers will miss flips sometimes. And if you do have the speed build, you've got the best odds of getting your setup as best you can before your opponent can then try and break down your walls, sort of thing. So having the speed build gives you the most chance of getting into your Spirit Links, into your Megas straight away, and basically filling through the whole deck so that you actually have less trainers in the deck, which is kind of interesting. It's in its own way decent against Toad because you run through the deck so quickly on your turn, that one turn. And the speed build as well. Like I say, mirror match is going to be the best. Just in general, it's the quickest way of playing Quasar, so why not go for that sort of thing? You could also tech it out with Empoleon. We've seen this a couple of times. It sort of end-proofs yourself, thanks to Skyfield as well. If both sides are using it to the fullest extent, it can hit 180, I think. Yeah, that's right, 180 for 1 energy, which is, I'd say that's pretty good. And he's a non-EX attacker as well. It helps you get through Safeguarders. This is an issue that Speed Quasar decks can face. Safeguarders can pretty much stonewall it if you're not running Raichu or Empoleon. Something to bear in mind yourselves there. The only other tech I can imagine is Ninetales, to be honest. If you're not going to play the egg build, where you have max out your Skyfield and have 2 or 3 executes to help you with Ultra Balls, comp searches, that sort of thing. But also when Skyfield hits the discard pile, you refill the bench with eggs. because they're readily accessible to you rather than having to dig through the whole deck to find more Pokemon. You can run Ninetales, try and Barrier Shrine, keep your thing in play for as long as possible, force them to at least catch you out, and then even then it stays for that turn, so you only need to find another bench Pokemon that turn to respond KO whatever's in front of you. So that's a route you can go down. Also, having the Ninetales gives you extra bright looks. This can help you pick off Shaymins, can help you against the Trevenant matchup, because you have, the 2 Ninetales plus, 1 or 2 Lysanders that you're going to play, so you have a lot more routes to get around Trevor, which is pretty interesting. So Ninetales is, again, a consideration you can do to try and keep Skyfield in play. It can actually help out against Groudon as well. You're both sort of not one-hitting each other, which is interesting. Or when your Skyfield does go, thanks to their Groudon, you can get rid of your Barrier Shrine Ninetales and then replay your Skyfield that following turn to try and reset yourself. So Ninetales is an interesting one. I try and take Ninetales in a lot of things right now. I'm really liking the combination of having extra catchers and trying to keep the stadium in play, because we've seen Stadium War is going to be huge. Every one of these top decks is playing like 3 or 4 of the stadium they want.
Yeah, definitely.
So Ninetales is pretty interesting to try and force your way into having the way you want it, basically. And in a lot of cases, the stadium does revolve around the whole strategy. Like, Lasers pretty much needs Verbank. Skyfield is obviously needed in terms of output for 2 of the big decks we're going to talk about. Groudon needs stadiums to stay around, so pretty much everything needs stadiums right now.
Yeah.
So having Ninetales is interesting.
Definitely. I mean, it's another deck, there's so many ways to play it. I feel probably, in how heavy of a Toad meta it is at the moment, Virizion is probably the most reliable to be able to deal with Toad, just because you've got a lot more outs than a lot of, well, definitely the speed variant has, because the speed is solely focused on using trainer draw support to run through all but 2 or 3 cards of the deck and get everything you need just to be able to hit 240 when they want, really. Ninetales is definitely a really interesting one, yeah. And then Raichu, again, just helps the mirror. Raichu is so strong at the moment. Onto the 4th archetype, it's Groudon, and there's not too many ways to play Groudon, but it's definitely one of the most I think it's one of the most intimidating decks out there at the moment, because if you're staring down a Primal Groudon with 4 energy, there is very little you can do about them. They're going to take 4 prizes pretty much no matter what, especially if you haven't damaged them in the first place. If you've got a completely clean Groudon staring you down, you're gonna have to expect them to take at least 4 prizes if you're playing EXs yourself. The Groudon type that we've seen the most of is probably with Wobbuffet, really. Just sort of sitting behind the Wobbuffet. Wobbuffet is so strong at the moment. Countering Shaymins is one of the most important things about Wobbuffet. But it also counters things like the Barrier Shrine, like a lot of these different other abilities that a lot of decks may focus around. It also means if you've just got Primals on the bench, there is nothing your opponent can do about getting out of this ability lock. It's often an easy way of setting up Garbodor. It's a much quicker way, and that's why we're not really seeing Garbodor in many of the decks at all anymore, because Wobbuffet just does it a whole lot quicker. And then, like I said, if you've got Primals on the bench, it means that you're not going to be able to do anything against your opponent's Primals, because of the Omega Barrier Ancient trait. It means they can't be Lysandered, they can't be Lasered, they can't be Headringed, they can't be Hammered. There is nothing you can do about a Groudon that's just attaching energy once per turn, building itself up, because inevitably you're going to have to deal with this Groudon. Another way of playing it is probably the speed way of playing it. There's a big difference between the Wobbuffet way of playing it and the speed way of playing it. The speed will probably be going for a lot of Mega Turbos, a lot of Spirit Links, aiming for a turn 2 or turn 3 big, huge Groudon hit. Searching through the deck for getting 1 or 2 Mega Turbos in a turn, maybe even using Landorus for a turn, just to get that extra attachment, so you're dealing with Groudon as quickly as possible. But I feel the superior build is probably the Wobbuffet build. In a lot of decks, you would expect to see Spirit Link, but a lot of people just don't play Spirit Link anymore. They sit behind the Wobbuffet. They don't mind wasting the turn evolving into the Primal, because it means they can attach some of these tools like Focus Sash. I've seen Hard Charm played, which is also disruptive in its own right. It's so important. And I think it was a couple of days ago on PTCGO, someone even playing EXP share with it. So you only need to attach 1 or 2 energy to a different Groudon. If you see a Groudon go down, you're going to be sort of powering up another 2 Groudons, which is really scary as well. It's just another way of being able to split up the energy and make sure you can keep streaming Groudons, because once you can, there's very little an opponent can do. I mean, this thing deals 200 plus damage a turn if it has access to the stadiums, and can definitely deal 240 because it's got, like all the fighting stuff, it's got so many toys, it's got strong energy, it's got fighting stadium. It can definitely deal huge chunks of damage every turn. The only other real way you can play it is the tanky way, which is basically all focused around having an undying Groudon, sort of setting up maybe 1, maybe 2 at worst, but then using other sort of tech Pokemon, maybe Dusknoir, the new Dragonite could be played. Basically, letting your Groudon take a few hits, and then somehow getting rid of all of the damage on it. It means that this Groudon all of a sudden has full HP, is dealing 200 damage a turn to you, and can't be hammered or lasered or anything like that. So, and if it keeps healing, even if they just get 1 or 2 heals off it in a game, that can sometimes mean the difference between winning and losing, because a lot of decks can't. Well, I think I can think of like 2 or 3 decks that can even take out a Groudon in one turn, if that. And if you're just sort of poking the Groudon, building up the damage turn by turn, if they then use a new Max Wind or anything like that, it's going to mean all of a sudden you've got a new Groudon on your hands. Obviously, Scramble Switch is huge in Groudon, and it's basically getting like a free Scramble Switch, because all of a sudden you've got a new Groudon, full with energy, hitting you again for 200, and you really can't do much against it. But yeah, there's not too many ways to play Groudon. I feel probably Wobbuffet is the strongest way of playing it, just because of how much of a lockdown your opponent can get, because they can't get out of the Wobbuffet very often because of the Omega Barrier, sorry. And then you can just build up a Groudon sort of as and when you please, and deal with your opponent when you want to. They can take as many single shot prizes on Wobbuffets as you want, because you're going to come in and you're going to be able to take 2 prizes on them pretty much straight away. They're then going to have to deal with a fully laid Groudon, which is a very scary thing.
Yeah, basically Groudon sacrifices its speed. It says, okay, I know I need to attach 4 energy. Maybe I'll have 1 or 2 chances to Mega Turbo, but ultimately I'm going for the turn 3, turn 4 style thing here. So I'm going to slow you down with Wobbuffet. I'm going to make sure you can't Bright Look me or Red Signal me if anyone's playing those things, which isn't very often anymore. But either way, there's no way you can get to my Groudon once I'm Primal. And then I'm sat here with 240 HP. Toad is hitting 50 a turn. Can't be lasered, remember. Can't be hammered. There's nothing you can do against this Groudon other than tech your own Pokemon, I guess. And we're just going to keep swinging. Even if something like a Rayquaza that can hit up to 240, we're going to play Focus Sash, so we don't get knocked out, and then they have to spend a Rayquaza to just take us down to 10 HP, and then we can scramble into a new one with a Focus Sash. And it's just such a unwinnable state. You can literally put your opponent into a state where they actually cannot win, no matter what they do. And that's what's really interesting about Groudon. It just says, you cannot stop this threat. And it's a very, very interesting tactic to go down, and essentially it's a very strong deck in all the ways you can see it. I think the tanky build, it's the slowest, but if it comes off, I mean, it's not going to come off too well against the trainer locking decks, but if it was against like the Rayquaza build, it's just, you just need to say your prayers really, because it's just impossible to beat this guy. It's actually impossible. Focus Sash with all the healing, it's just, you cannot stop that, and that's what's really interesting about Groudon.
Obviously, with Groudon, the big thing is the setup. And again, like we said in the first part, it's all about the list. I've seen such a wide variety of lists online, because I've personally been looking into Groudon, because I think it's a really strong play at the moment. But I just want to touch on a quick point. The list is so important, especially for a big tournament like Nationals, because this tournament, consistency is king. With the other earlier tournaments, you can sort of mess around with tech cards, see if they work. In this tournament, consistency is king, and adjusting to the meta is king. And if you can nail both of that, I could certainly see Groudon winning a fair amount of Nationals, in all honesty, because like Joe said, there is sometimes nothing that can stop this guy, and
Yeah,
it's quite scary.
that's really where I think Groudon definitely simplicity is the key. Have a high energy count, have a lot of supporters, a lot of Karinas definitely. Karina is your automatic Groudon even against Trainer Lock. Just have it super simple. You don't even need that many Mega Turbos. If you've got Karina, if you're in those matchups where you can use trainers, you have access to it quite easily. So I even play a low Ultra Ball count, a low Mega Turbo count, and just go simply. I'm having a lot of energy so that I can draw into it, even if I'm under these trainer locks and I've only got supporters to help me draw. And I'm also just gonna consistently get Groudon out turn after turn. And like I say, it is when you just have that board state of a Groudon with the energy, it itself is almost a win condition sometimes. So you don't need to get fancy with it. It just needs to be that simple. So on to a completely different deck, one that actually could pose a threat to Groudon. And this has come around. Well, we know Flare. Okay, it's stage ones basically, and we know that Flareon has always attempted to be the anti-meta deck that can beat almost all the board. And now we just have extra toys for this deck. So Flareon itself doesn't get that strong. I mean, it still has Compressor, it still has Archie, I guess. You can still play that sort of deck, but it's really Leafeon and Raichu that get a lot stronger. We've actually profiled Leafeon Raichu on its own if you want to just counter these sorts of things. And basically, it's a very simple state of mind. We want to have type coverage over Rayquaza, and we want to have type coverage with Leafeon over Seismitoad and Groudon. This is pretty easy. We're going to use non-EX attackers to hit huge chunks on EXs and win prize trade. Very simple concept, but it can work really well. Raichu with Muscle Band or Bangle can hit 180 or 190 with a full bench thanks to Skyfield. So even if we're up against other things that aren't these guys, we can still sometimes get knockouts on EXs as quickly as turn 2. Even turn 1 if we want to tech a Wally in there. Excuse me. And Leafeon having resistance to Seismitoad and also having weakness on the Toad and on Groudon. Groudon's forced to attach 4 energy unless they're playing Shrine of Memories. Even then, they're not doing any damage to Leafeon. Basically, Groudon needs 4 energy to do anything. So Leafeon is going to start tearing through that quite easily. Even with Focus Sash, like the trade is just so nice. They have to run through probably 3 Leafeons in your deck. And eventually you'll get through a Groudon. And then they have to hide again with a Wobbuffet. And then you can go back to your Raichu and kill. And essentially you're going to run them out of time, basically. That's what you're trying to do in that matchup. Against Seismitoad, you've got resistance. You can tech Virizion in there. You can have 1 or 2 go as anti-Toad as you want, so that this Leafeon will not die to a Toad without a fight. Against Trevenant, it's a bit more difficult. The Virizion's obviously there to stop damage output, and Trevenant on its own naturally isn't going to be killing. But Trevenant is a bit more awkward because of the extra snipes it can do to pretty much threaten the lower stuff you have, because you need to have Pikachu, you need to have Eevee. You could take Mime in your own deck because it does help the basic count, I guess, for your Raichus and Leafeons. So a lot of considerations there. How else you could play Raichu decks? I've again profiled another deck. It's Raichu Ninetales. Again, loving all that Ninetales shenanigans. Locking in that Skyfield, ensuring yourself knockouts turn after turn pretty much with Raichu. It does limit yourself a little bit against Toad because you are stuck at 160, which is not very nice. But locking it in, having Bright Look so that we can always hit into EXs, basically force your opponent into saying, I want to finish this game in 4 turns. Can you stop me doing that? And it's a very quick deck. It doesn't need much to get going. It's not too threatened by hammers in the sense that you expect your 90 HP Pokemon to die anyway. So if they're going to hammer you, why haven't they killed you sort of thing? It doesn't really love Trainer Lock though, because if you're not drawing into... I mean, you don't have the access to the DCs as nicely, so you will miss turns of attacking now and again. But definitely with Leafeon, it's stronger. You can also go for Raichu Bats. This is one I personally love. I just need to... I don't know how convinced I am in terms of beating Seismitoad, because obviously you lose the main attacker in terms of Leafeon, and you trade it out for Raichu. And with a Bats list, we've talked a lot about Bats, actually. It's such a good tech card. But for the Raichu, it means that it can hit magic numbers so much nicer. So now that we were stuck at 160, we can drop a Crobat and actually one-shot Seismitoads. This is a whole new threat for a whole new different ball game. something we've not really talked about much is that obviously Quasar is going to be teching Altaria. They would be mad not to. So the whole basis of Raichu one-shotting Quasar doesn't happen. But with bats, you can, once again, even with Altaria, you can just go bat, 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 and still kill him. So you make the numbers as good as you like by having the bats. Also, you can pepper up Groudons so that they can't use their Focus Sash shenanigans, or at least put them down to like 50 HP lower, so the Raichu's in touching distance of it. So then you can drop a bat the following turn to try and knock it out. The bat really does just allow you to hit a lot of numbers really early, and that's a threat in itself. And also, it's good against Leafeon Raichu, because you have these extra counters that you can place around the board while your opponent is stuck with Leafeon, who's not doing too much in that matchup.
Yeah. I mean, again, we could talk about stage ones for ages, because there's so many different stage ones that you can pair, and it's another meta thing, but Raichu Leaf and Raichu Bats are definitely probably two of the best variants out there at the moment. Obviously, like Joe said, Raichu Leaf has coverage all over the board, and Raichu Bats just peppers up stuff, and it is able to take sort of knockouts a little bit quicker, so it could be seen as a faster version of Raichu Leaf, I suppose, but perhaps with less type coverage. The penultimate sort of archetype we're going to talk about is one that I touched on earlier on. It's Donphan, and there's still like a few ways to play Donphan. Donphan sort of saw a dip in popularity around when Primal Clash came out, but it's sort of seen a rise again, especially now we've got now Trevor is a lot better, especially now we've got Shaman as well. Shaman really helps the deck, especially if you want to play a speed version. Probably one of the most important versions is the Robo Substitute sort of speed version, where you're going to be running a lot of speed cards, and you're going to be running through your deck relatively quickly, and pretty much hitting turn 2 always, at least 60 damage, and then hitting and switching into a Robo Substitute, denying your opponent prizes. They're going to play Life Dew, so even if you are taking out the Donphan, sometimes you're not even getting a prize for that. You can take 8 or 9 knockouts and not even win the game, especially if they can keep trump carding back in their Robo Subs and then searching them back out again. There's so much that Donphan can do. It's another deck that obviously has the fighting toys as well, and sort of increases its damage with Strong Energy and Muscle Band or Bangle, and then the Fighting Stadium as well against EXs. So Donphan definitely has a favourable matchup against some pretty big decks around at the moment. I feel Donphan probably works the best against stage ones, because a lot of the time Raichu cannot deal with Donphan. Raichu is one shot by Donphan. Pretty much they need one of their multitude of different things that they can do to increase their damage. You eat up the EVs as well. You eat up the Pikachus. There's very little that Raichu Leafeon can do, at least. The big way of sort of getting around Donphan is actually using Lysanders to get rid of their Donphans. So that's probably the easiest way to deal with Donphan. But the other there are 2 or 3 variants that you could also play. Donphan Trevenant is definitely seeing more and more play. It's sort of, again, it was sort of popular as soon as Donphan became popular. It then sort of dipped again and saw 1 or 2 good solid wins. I know definitely in the UK it got a win, because no one was expecting it whatsoever, and it was a really good play at the time. And then it sort of dipped again, and now at Nationals it's another really good play just because of how strong Trevenant becomes. And then the Wobbuffet version is similar to Trevenant, however it's locking your opponent's abilities as opposed to items, meaning that they're getting no Shamans whatsoever. And you can save the space that you'd usually use for your Shamans and increase consistency cards with things like Roller Skates or Trainer's Mail. Trainer's Mail is another really good card for Donphan, because it just searches for, looks for a trainer, and more often than not it's going to be an autoplay trainer that you're going to be able to use and hopefully power up a Donphan or increase the amount of things you're going to be able to do in that turn. The final sort of big way of playing Donphan is pairing it with like maybe a 1-1 or a 2-2 Groudon, and just sort of hitting and switching into maybe robots or a Wobbuffet, building up a Groudon, and then all of a sudden taking the last two or three knockouts with the Groudon. If it's EXs, you're probably going to need to take 1 or 2 knockouts with the Groudon, and that could secure even 4 prizes. Obviously, much like Groudon in itself, it can't be lasered, it can't be hammered, it can't be Lysandered, so you can, rather than sitting behind a Wobbuffet, you can actually be dealing damage, peppering your opponents up, and then swinging for Groudon. Sometimes you don't even need the stadium to be able to take big knockouts, because you've done so much residual damage with Donphan in the first place. Obviously, the Groudon build is so much more sort of inconsistent, and it's a lot clunkier. But you can probably save on some cards that you would put towards the Groudon instead. It's definitely a scary concept, but I feel Groudon itself is a stronger play than Donphan Groudon personally. There's obviously the locking versions like Trevenant or Wobbuffet are very big threats, and are more often than not going to have bigger damage output than the Trevenant is probably going to have a bigger damage output than Trevenant naturally anyway. The only big thing about Donphan is it has a pretty bad Trevenant matchup itself. Obviously, Trevenant has resistance on it, so you're going to be two-shotting Trevenants at least. You're never going to be one-shotting a Trevenant unless you're wrecking. And if you're wrecking to knock out a Trevenant, you're probably not doing something too right, because they're going to be able to swing at you again, because they're going to have a consistent list, and they're going to be able to get trainers as well. Plus, they're going to be locking you out of trainers, meaning that you're going to have to sort of really search through your deck using supporters rather than trainers. And then Rayquaza can be a bit of a difficult matchup as well, again because of resistance, and they need very little to be able to one-shot a Donphan. They only need 5 Pokemon, which isn't even difficult for them a lot of the time. Even if they're not hunting for the Skyfield and hunting for a big bench, they're often going to have 5 Pokemon on the bench no matter what. So there's definitely issues with Donphan, but Donphan can definitely pull out some big knockouts out of nowhere. And the hit and switch tactic has always been a pretty big one, and quite a scary one in all honesty.
Yeah, I'm actually a big advocate of Donphan. Really, really like him. I know that Ollie Barnett in the UK, he's pretty much got his world's invite from just playing Donphan. He played a pretty interesting build as well. He played it with 4 teammates in his deck, and this really does help your matchup against Seismitoad and Trevenant, because essentially you teammates so that you can find yourselves these strong energies and either a supporter for the following turn or fighting stadiums, and basically you just have a high Horlucha count to try and trade on Toads as best you can. And basically Donphan only needs this 1 energy, so does Horlucha, and if you have enough teammates in your deck, you can actually be selective, whereas the rest of your deck, you have all of these speed cards, loads of trainer-based draw for every other matchup, so you're really quick in those matchups, but then you have teammates for picking up the things you need. I really like the teammates builds. I think that's really cool. And in the build he used 4 Robo Subs and a Life Dew as well. So it has a lot of stall power. And what's interesting to note is, if you're in a matchup like a Trevenant where you think it's going to be really awkward and you don't really like it, you can really stall a lot of time with Donphan and bring matchups that you don't like into a draw. And this is a deck that I can't really say that about the other decks. Toad, if it's into a bad matchup, like a Leafeon, sometimes it doesn't have the answers, it will lose. Against a Groudon, it can lose. And it doesn't have many ways of preventing its bad matchups from winning. Whereas Donphan can go, okay, not going to win this game, let's stop my opponent from winning this game. And that's what I really like about Donphan. You can even just sit there sometimes going 4 Robo Subs and either 1 Horlucha or 1 Phanpy with that Life Dew on. And you just let them not take a prize. Turn, trump card, search. And yeah, it's just really difficult to allow your opponent to win if you don't want them to. Even when you win game 1, you know you win that best of 3 because you can draw a game out. You can draw 1 game out to like an hour if you really need to with Donphan. This is what's really crazy about the deck. I really like it. And in terms of the Donphan with Groudon, I actually think you've kind of undersold it a little bit, Jack, because Donphan only really needs a couple of turns. People are so concerned about trying to Lysandra it up and hitting through Robo Subs. You only really need, like, you can even play like a single Groudon and a Maxie's hidden ball trick to put that Groudon on the bench, and then you go for a scramble switch play when you've got like 2 or 3 energy on your Donphans, because you only need to commit 1 energy to each Donphan each time, and you can slowly stack them up against most decks. And even if they're Lysandering and taking out 1 Donphan, you've got another one there with 2 energy. So you can just wait for your scramble play, and then you've boom got a whole new threat for your opponent to deal with, and they've like no answer to that at that point. So there's the life due build where you can stall out games even if you've got a bad matchup you can win. Donphan, I think anyway, has a good matchup against Groudon, has a great matchup against stage ones. Quasar is awkward, but you can make it awkward for them. Like, you can put the life deal on your Donphan that you're always attacking with. You can force them to take all the robos for as long as possible. Just not benching the stuff that's going to give them any prizes, really. Force them to take a prize every like 6 turns. So even if you are running into these Rayquazas a lot, you're still not giving your opponent any leeway in that matchup. And yeah, I think Donphan is still a really good play. The real Achilles heel is Trevor. Trevenant, I don't see many answers for Trevor because you can't do the Robo sub stall unless you get a Lysander turn and you happen to be holding 2 or 3 Robos in hand. Donphan can really struggle against Trevor. The resistance is horrible. Fighting Stadium doesn't even help you out in most cases. It doesn't take much for Trevenant not only to kill your whatever's active, it's also putting damage onto your Donphan and threatening that, and threatening your Hawlucha, which you pretty much rely on that game anyway. So Hawlucha can, not Hawlucha, Trevenant can really destroy Donphan quite happily. So that would be the big Achilles heel. And if you're trying to handle the Trevenant, you need to play the Groudon build. You can't have the other two. It just doesn't work like that. But the other 2 builds are still useful. Wobbuffet, obviously helpful for helping against Seismitoad as well, helping against Quasar in the main. But for me, if you're going to play Donphan and you're expecting some capacity of Trevenant, which I think it's fair to say we will see some capacity, you need to play Groudon. Otherwise, you're just going to lose a lot of games.
Yeah. The final sort of archetype that we're going to talk about, we've gone through the first 6. The last one is more of just like another archetype really that's very splashable and you can do so much with. It's actually going to be Manectric. So obviously, straight off the bat, typing is advantageous against anything that has Rayquaza in the name, anything that has what sort of Shaman. You're going to be doing huge damage against these cards no matter what. You can then tech out the Manectric build based on the sort of meta or the sort of things that you want to beat. There's Toad Manectric Garbodor, which in theory has a really good matchup against a lot. Toad is obviously disruptive in itself. Garbodor is inclusively disruptive as well, and also stops Shamans. And then the Manectric is really good against the Rayquaza. Sorry, yeah, it's really good against taking out the Rayquaza, which are 3 pretty big important things at the moment. If you can deal with Rayquaza, if you can stop Shaman, if you can stall, you have a good deck. Because a lot of the time, decks won't be able to deal with all 3 of those factors, or at least 2 of the factors. And if they're Rayquaza, they won't be able to deal with all 3 of the factors. Since Rayquaza relies so much on Shaman, well, every deck relies so much on Shaman, but Rayquaza even more so. It's definitely a very sort of anti-meta deck, I feel. It's looked at the meta, and it's sort of decided we need to be able to take out Rayquazas, but we need to be able to stop Shamans as well, because Rayquaza isn't the only thing in the meta. Obviously, Manectric itself, a lot of people have strayed away from using the Mega Manectric, and are actually just using Manectric on its own for that second attack, Assault Laser, I believe it's called, which does 120 if they've got a tool, and pretty much everything in the field at the moment is going to be using a tool at some point to try and give itself an advantage against other decks. So you're going to be doing 120 damage for 2 energy, which is insane value for the amount of sort of effort you need to put in to get these 2 energy on. It becomes sort of less valuable if you do get Head Ringed or anything like that, but because a lot of the time the decks are only going to be playing basic energy anyway, they're going to have access to 1 more energy, and 120 for 3 still isn't anything to sniff at really, considering there's no downsides at all. Do you want to...
Yeah, there's a couple other ways you can play Manectric, I guess. The Rough Seas build is definitely a way you can go about it. This is really to try and help you survive against Seismitoad and Trevenant as well. Basically, you sit there with 210 210 HP or
Yep.
220?
Yeah, 210.
Yeah. And you have Rough Seas counterbalancing the Verbank Laser. You have the free retreat on Mega Manectric. It's just a really inherently strong card. You hit for 2 energy if you're not being head ringered. You can also just play DCE, so you're still getting that cost for the 2 energy, really. So that you're two-shotting these guys. You one-shot Trevenant, which is great. You one-shot a Wobbuffet, so the 110 is a great number to hit. You hit through Raichus, you hit through Leafeons. You are pretty quick. You have energy acceleration if you're going Mega at least. So you have a lot of toys at your disposal. And Rough Seas really helps out against Raichu Leafeon as well. Keeps you out of range a lot of the time. Stops Skyfield from putting into the field, all of that stuff. It helps out against, like I say, Toad and Trevenant, the big things. You just need to keep healing. Free retreat out of there. Definitely if you're using water-type techs as well, you can use Keldeo to help yourself move. You can use Suicune as well. Suicune Rough Seas on its own can be enough to beat like Quasar sometimes. So you can really tech out your build with Manectric. It seems to be one of these decks, because it's an energy accelerator, because it doesn't really need much to get going, it has a bit of space in there to help different matchups. So the Manectric Rough Seas build is very important. I really love Rough Seas, especially because, like I say, this free retreat and you've got the acceleration means that you can go into a different attacker, still be doing stuff, and leave this guy on the bench for 3, 4, 5 turns and allow the Rough Seas to rack up until you're basically back to full HP. And it's difficult for Toad if they're only doing the 50 from the Quaking Punch and not getting that additional Verbank Laser combo. It's really hard. It's almost like a Groudon in a way, how many turns it's going to take them to start killing Manectrics. It does get a bit more awkward when you fall asleep when you get flipped, but it's something you have to live with, really. The other way I like playing Manectric, once again, my favourite tech right now, it is Ninetales builds. I've been trying out with Ninetales a lot in a lot of decks. It works really nicely with Manectric. And at the moment, I've been playing it with a combination of Silent Lab and Rough Seas. Rough Seas is too important for the Toad and the Trevenant overall. But you still need this Silent Lab. It's really good against Rayquaza. It's really good against Raichu Leafeon. It's great against Groudon as well, because it actually stops their Wobbuffet, so that the Barrier Shrine stays into play, and so that the Bright Look actually can work. So it's really funny to see Silent Lab stops the Wobbuffet, which allows us to stop stopping. It's an interesting combination, but it actually does work. So Silent Lab, really, really useful with Manectric, and because, like I say, an inherently strong card, it has the space. I can see it working really nicely. The only issue if you do go down the Ninetales route is that you will get destroyed by Donphan a lot of the time. They don't need that stadium to stay in play, and once your one goes, really, really awkward for you. You can't get rid of your own Ninetales as if it was the Skyfield builds, which I've mentioned Ninetales in before. So you just lose all of that incentive really there for yourself. And also it gets stomped by Donphan a lot of the time. You can probably tech in Zapdos, I guess. I wouldn't really find space for more than 2 for the majority of the time, and it is going to ruin overall consistency of that deck. You could also tech Mewtwo, I guess.
Yeah.
That's also a more splashable way, again, helping with Groudon. But there's a lot of avenues for Ninetales with Manectric, and Manectric in general. Rough Seas is such a strong card, and it's a low-energy attacker. Like you say, even as a non-EX, those numbers are really magical, really good at killing Trevor.
Yeah.
Very good card, to be honest.
The only other build we haven't talked about is one that I profiled on the channel, which was Manectric Bats, or Batman, as you know, it should definitely be called, which just sort of focuses on using that assault laser and taking knockouts a lot quicker, because you're doing 120, or you can even use the first attack. I think it's called Overrun, which is sort of a beaten down Landorus attack, but still. The snipe is really useful, and with bats you can really pick and choose where you take your prizes. Obviously, the Shaman has a bit more HP than Jirachi, so it's not as much of a target, but Shaman is definitely still a decent target for snipe damage. And again, you've got weakness on Shamans as well. So I feel Manectric Bats is definitely another good way of playing it, just because you can pick and choose sort of where you can take your prizes, and how you deal with your opponent's board. It's a lot more versatile than, some of the decks that just have to always hit face. It can sort of decide how it wants to take the win in a lot of cases. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I think we're at about another 40-minute video, so hopefully we really thank you if you've managed to get through at least this one. Obviously, if you watched the first one as well, we really appreciate it. We're getting very close to 500 subs now, which is mental. I don't think me and Joe ever really thought we were going to get this far. So just a huge thank you to you guys. We've really enjoyed doing what we do, and as far as we're concerned, we're not stopping anytime soon. So definitely, hopefully this has helped with your Nationals experience. Obviously, UK Nationals is on Saturday. Both me and Joe will be there, so come and say hi if you see us. We will both be sort of, I would imagine we'll sort of do some deck analysis after Nationals, perhaps some things that we missed. There may be some new lists that we see, and we'll analyse sort of what's happened after UK Nationals, and hopefully, obviously, UK Nationals is first, but this will hopefully sort of run through to the other Nationals over the next few weeks, because I would imagine the format will be relatively similar throughout them, just sort of there'll be a bigger deck each week, basically countering the deck the week before. So hopefully we've given you a lot of different ideas on what you can play for your Nationals, and we wish you all the best of luck. But by that, I've been Jack from Omnipoke, and that's been Joe, and we would love to see you in another video. Thank you very much for watching, guys.